My name is Hannah Brooks, and I'm 28 years old. 3 days before my wedding, my parents sat me down in my mother's kitchen and told me they wanted my grandfather removed from the head table. He's a retired janitor, Hannah, my mother said, stirring her coffee like those words didn't cost her a thing. He worked at a middle school for 30 years. Your father's business partners will be there. The Whitfields will be there. What are people supposed to think? I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. My father, Richard Brooks, sat beside her, nodding along with his arms crossed. His jaw tightened the way it always did whenever he'd already made up his mind and just needed me to go along with it. He embarrasses us, my father added, like that settled the whole deal. Something cracked open inside my chest, hot and sharp. My grandfather, Walter, was the reason my life turned out the way it did. When my parents were busy climbing whatever ladder they thought meant success, Walter was the one who picked me up from school every single day for 6 years. Walter was the one who sat beside me at the kitchen table until midnight, helping me study for exams he never even got the chance to take himself. Walter was also the one who paid for my community college tuition out of his own pension after my parents claimed there wasn't enough money left that year, even though there always seemed to be plenty for my mother's designer handbags and my father's golf memberships. Not once did he make me feel like his sacrifices were some kind of burden. He made me feel like I was worth every bit of it. He's sitting at the head table, I said. That's final. My mother's face immediately went tight. Hannah, be reasonable. This isn't about love. It's about optics. You're marrying into a family with real standing. Do you have any idea what it'll look like? A man in a rented suit who smells like a school hallway sitting beside the Whitfields. He smells like peppermints, I shot back. Because he keeps a bag of them in his pocket for kids who scrape their knees. That's who he is. My father let out a sharp breath through his nose, the sound he always made when he was done pretending to negotiate. We raised you better than this kind of sentimentality. Family events are about presentation. You know that. No, I said, standing so fast my chair scraped across the tile floor. You know that. I know my grandfather drove 2 hours round trip every day for years, so I wouldn't have to come home to an empty house. I know he never once asked for anything in return. And I know that if he's not welcome at the head table, then apparently neither am I. The room fell completely silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. My mother's mouth opened, then closed again. My father looked at me like I was some stranger who had wandered into his house uninvited. Fine, he finally said, his voice flat, cold, and straight up emotionless. We'll see how this plays out. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. The rehearsal dinner 2 nights later felt tense in a way that was impossible to ignore. My future mother-in-law, Diane, kept glancing at me with quiet concern. My fiancé, Theo, squeezed my hand under the table more than once, silently asking if I was okay. I kept telling him I was fine. Truth be told, I wasn't so sure that was true. My parents showed up late, sat stiffly through the appetizers, and barely spoke to anyone. When the wedding coordinator started reviewing the seating chart and confirmed that Walter would, in fact, be seated beside me at the head table, my mother slowly placed her fork down with a sharp click that echoed across the private dining room. We need to speak with you. Now. I followed them into the hallway, my heart pounding big time. My father didn't waste a second. If that man sits at the head table tomorrow, he said, we will not be attending the wedding. I searched his face for even the smallest sign that he was bluffing. There wasn't one. Then don't come, I replied. The words came out steadier than I expected. My mother's eyes turned glossy, not from sadness, but from anger. You're choosing him over your own parents. I'm choosing decency over cruelty, I answered. There's a huge difference. Without another word, they walked out of the rehearsal dinner. They didn't say goodbye to anyone. They didn't even glance at Walter, who sat quietly at the far end of the table, sipping his water and pretending not to notice the storm that had just rolled through the hallway barely 10 feet away. When I sat back down beside him, he gently patted my hand. You didn't have to do that for me, he said softly. Yes, I whispered, my voice cracking despite my best effort. Yeah, I really did. He didn't say another word. He simply squeezed my hand the same way he used to when I was 7 years old and terrified of thunderstorms, like somehow his grip alone could keep the whole world steady. I had absolutely no idea, not even for a second, that the real reckoning hadn't even begun yet. The wedding morning arrived warm and glowing, the kind of golden light that makes every photo look like it belongs in a magazine. I got dressed in the small room behind the chapel with my hands trembling, not because I had second thoughts about marrying Theo, but because of the empty space in the front row where my parents should have been sitting. They didn't come. Not to the ceremony. Not to watch me walk down the aisle. Not to hear me say my vows. Instead, Walter walked me down the aisle. His old dress shoes had been polished so carefully I could see my reflection in them, and his eyes stayed misty the entire walk. When the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" Walter lifted his head proudly and answered without hesitation. "Her grandfather does, with everything I have." I cried through nearly half the ceremony. Not sad tears. The good kind. The kind that hit you when you finally realize the people who truly loved you were the ones standing beside you all along. The reception was held in a beautifully restored barn just outside town, with strings of warm lights stretching across the ceiling and long tables dressed in crisp white linen. Walter sat exactly where he belonged, right beside me at the head table. He looked just a little uncomfortable in his rented suit, but every time another guest stopped to shake his hand or congratulate him, he sat a little taller. About an hour into dinner, I noticed a woman I didn't recognize walking through the room with quiet confidence and purpose. She looked to be around 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair neatly pulled back and a sharp navy dress that immediately told everyone she wasn't just another wedding guest. Theo leaned closer. "That's Margaret Ellison," he whispered. "My dad's CEO. I had no idea she was coming. She must have received an invitation through the firm." My stomach instantly tightened. Margaret Ellison ran one of the biggest logistics companies in the entire state. Over the years, I'd heard my father casually mention her name more than once, usually while talking about how badly he wanted to impress her. If there was one person my parents would have been terrified of looking bad in front of, it was Margaret Ellison. But here's the thing. Margaret didn't walk toward Theo. She didn't come to me. Instead, she headed straight toward Walter. The entire room seemed to slow down as she approached the head table. She stopped directly in front of him and extended her hand. "Walter Brooks," she said. Something in her voice made everyone nearby go completely quiet. "I don't know if you remember me." Walter looked up, squinting with confusion. Then suddenly, his eyes widened. "Maggie? Maggie Ellison? Good Lord. It's been 41 years. Margaret smiled, and for the first time, the polished corporate executive disappeared, replaced by someone far more personal. The nearest tables had already gone silent. Guests stopped eating. Conversations faded away. People slowly turned in their chairs to watch what was happening. Margaret pulled over an empty chair and sat beside my grandfather as though they were two old friends catching up after decades apart. Because, as it turned out, that's exactly what they were. "Walter was the janitor at Redwood Elementary," Margaret said, speaking loudly enough for nearly half the room to hear. "I was 11 years old when my father lost his job. Some weeks, we couldn't even afford lunch. I used to hide in the supply closet so nobody would notice I wasn't eating." Her voice caught for just a second. "Walter found me there. Every single day for 2 years, he quietly left a sandwich and an apple on the shelf where I hid. He never said a word. He never made me feel ashamed. He never made me feel small for needing help. And he never told a single person. I didn't even learn it was him until years later, after I'd already graduated, when one of my teachers accidentally let it slip." By now, the entire room had gone absolutely still. You could have heard a pin drop. I glanced at my father's empty seat and felt my throat tighten. If only he could have seen what was happening. Margaret slowly turned toward Walter. She gently took his weathered hand in both of hers. Then she looked him straight in the eyes, and quietly spoke 4 words that every single person in that barn would remember for the rest of their lives. "You saved my life." A wave of quiet gasps swept across the nearby tables. Then someone near the back started clapping. Another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, nearly half the room was on its feet, applauding. Walter, this quiet, humble man who had spent 30 years mopping hallways, fixing broken lockers, and slipping peppermints into the hands of crying kids, just sat there completely stunned. His eyes filled with tears. He looked overwhelmed, almost like he didn't know what to do with all the attention suddenly surrounding him. Margaret gently smiled before continuing. I run a company with more than 400 employees now, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind every word. I've created scholarship programs for children growing up in exactly the situation I was in. But none of that would have happened without a janitor who noticed a hungry little girl and quietly decided to help. No recognition. No applause. No expectation of getting anything back. He simply cared. I felt tears welling up again. Then I thought about my parents. About the word they'd used. Embarrassing. I thought about how they had stayed away from this wedding because they were ashamed of the man sitting beside me. And now, one of the most respected CEOs in the entire state was publicly crediting that same man for changing the course of her life. The irony was almost unbelievable. My parents weren't there to witness it. They didn't hear Margaret Ellison tell an entire room that her success started with a school janitor who quietly refused to let a little girl go hungry. They missed every second of it. Later, one of my cousins told me the story spread through my father's business circle within days. Apparently, someone at the reception had recorded Margaret's speech. The video made its way around faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, my father had already heard exactly what happened. He learned exactly which 4 words Margaret Ellison had spoken. He learned exactly who she had spoken them to. And he learned exactly how every important business associate he'd spent years trying to impress had witnessed the entire moment. According to my cousin, my father's face went completely pale. No kidding. For the first time in his life, his obsession with appearances had completely backfired. Walter never asked for an apology. Honestly, he never even expected one. He never thought of himself as someone who needed validation. He'd spent his entire life helping people simply because it was the right thing to do. Not because anyone was watching. Not because he wanted recognition. Just because that's who he was. That was always enough for him. A few weeks after the wedding, Margaret invited Walter to speak at one of her company's community events honoring local heroes. At first, he laughed and said they had the wrong guy. I'm just a retired janitor, he told her. Margaret smiled. No, Walter, she answered. You're the reason people like me get the chance to become anything at all. He eventually agreed. Watching him stand on that stage in front of hundreds of employees, receiving a standing ovation he never chased, was one of the proudest moments of my life. Afterward, dozens of people lined up just to shake his hand. Some shared stories about teachers, coaches, custodians, and neighbors who had quietly changed their lives too. Others simply thanked him. Walter accepted every handshake with the same humble smile he'd always worn, as if he still couldn't believe any of it. Months later, my parents finally reached out. Not with an apology. Not really. My mother sent a short message saying maybe things had gotten a little out of hand. My father never acknowledged what he'd said about Walter. Instead, he asked if we could all have dinner and move forward. I read the message twice before putting my phone down. Then I walked into my grandfather's living room, where he was sitting in his favorite chair, working on one of his crossword puzzles. You know, I said with a grin, Mom and Dad want to have dinner. Walter looked up over the top of his glasses. Well, that's nice. You thinking about going? I smiled. Only if they save you the seat at the head of the table. Walter chuckled softly. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a peppermint, and handed it to me the same way he had when I was a little kid. Some things, the best things, never need to change. Because real character isn't measured by someone's job title. It isn't measured by expensive clothes, fancy dinners, or the opinions of people trying way too hard to impress everyone else. Real character is measured by the quiet things nobody sees, the sacrifices nobody applauds, the kindness that's given without expecting anything in return. My grandfather understood that his entire life. It just took everyone else a little longer to catch up. And honestly, that was their loss, not his.